This is going to be a first for me. You usually see me up here with a few papers. Well, I forgot those few papers this morning. I wrote down a couple of things just so that I keep on track, because I can stand up and talk. I can talk for a couple of hours, but what I say wouldn't be worth it. So, and I don't want to subject you to anything. But I'm sorry I skipped the hymn too, but actually, that hymn will be better sung at the very end of the sermon. So that is Bring Many Names. We'll put that at the end.
Sure.
Sure, okay.
It's your thing. Do what you want to do.
How many of you remember the first time you heard your name? Yeah, me neither. Me neither. And yet, as we grew, we learned to understand that when that particular name was said, it referred to us in a special way. And it was usually in a warm and loving way, so we had a connection. And our name became very important to us. That's why at baptism we always say, and what shall this child's name be? By what name shall this child be called? It is the idea that we're connecting, making these relationships that begin to build. What do you remember, though, about your nicknames? Does anyone dare admit what his or her nickname was as a child? Yeah. Little Mo's? Little Mo.
So I pretended I didn't like it, and then you would call me back.
Oh, okay. Little Mo. Does anybody else have a name, a nickname that they remember? Yeah, Tom.
My brother called me Tommy.
Tommy, that's cute.
Tom B.
Oh, Tom B. Tom B. Yes. Okay. Anybody else have a nickname that they're willing to share?
My mom called me Carrie.
Carrie. Nice. I like that. Yeah.
I went in Carolyn, so. So that lasted till I was like 22.
Anybody else want to share? Well, I think Carrie sounds a lot better than the one that I'll now admit I had. Woofy. Yeah, you're right. Spelled W-U-F-F-I-E. Woofy. How that came from Ruth, I don't know. They didn't call me Ruthie. They called me Woofy. Well, that was a name that did not go to college with me, as you can imagine. I left that behind. And never had a nickname, with a name like Ruth, other than Ruthie. And no one has ever called me Ruthie, except for there are two long-term friends who call me that. And for some reason, it's not my favorite, but because of these two people and who they are, it's a term of endearment to me, in spite of the fact that it would not be what I would choose for someone to call me. Well, we have our given names and our nicknames and the names that others give us. How about the names we give ourselves? Now, this is something that, as I was growing up, I was not aware of. But in more recent days, I am aware of how many people have changed their names for very important reasons. And some of the most famous ones that come up are people like Cassius Clay, who became Muhammad Ali, Malcolm Henry Little, Malcolm X. That's an interesting story, because it turns out that this man, Henry Little, dates back to the 1500s. He was one of the first slave traders from Portugal, between Portugal and Africa. And he really made it his, quote, profession to be a slave trader. Well, it wasn't until Malcolm X was quite a bit older. I'm sorry, I'm getting my names confused. Forget what I just said. Malcolm Little changed his name because he found out that his name Little, he referred to it as his slave name, his slave name. And so he just decided to take X for unknown, which when you consider the history of slaves, that makes a lot of sense. But then, in a way, Malcolm became known to himself and to God when he became a follower of Islam. And then he changed his name, and I can't say it correctly, I'm sure, to Malcolm El Hajj Malik El Shabazz, which now is a true representation of who he himself is and what he stood for. And the other person I was thinking of, whose name was Henry Rogers, Ibram Henry Rogers. Have any of you seen the name Ibram lately on the book cover? You will if you haven't yet. You might have seen the whole name. He is now Ibram Solani Kendi. Ibram Henry Rogers found out in studying his history that it was his ancestor, or not his ancestor, but someone he had been named for through his generations, that was the slave trader. And when he learned that, he changed that to another name that meant more to him. And the Solani, I believe, means beloved. And Kendi also has a name. And these are things I could tell you if I have my notes. But I cannot remember exactly what the translation was. But he took on this name because of what he learned. And I learned about him because of the book I had been reading, and I recommend it to all of you, How to Be an Anti-Racist. One of the things that he talks about in that book is what happens when we label or name people, especially groups, rather than even hearing from an individual. I think it's very interesting when you meet someone to find out what their name means to them, how they see themselves. And I guess Jesus felt that way too. Jesus asked his disciples, in this passage, now when Jesus came to the district of Caesarea, in Philippi, he asked his disciples, who do people say the Son of Man is? Well, wouldn't you think they would have known? They had spent not a long time with him, but a very intimate and intense time. And you'd think by that time they'd have understood what his name was and who he was and what he represented. Well, they came back with some answers that were not too far off base, but remember, they're still being asked, who do people say I am? Oh, they say John the Baptist, but others say Elijah, and still others say Jeremiah or one of the other prophets. These were all very logical answers, because they were prophets. John the Baptist started the path for Jesus to walk on and actually baptized Jesus. And there were those like Elijah who was able to raise a child from the dead and also was out there speaking about how people had to change their ways. And Jeremiah, who probably was the strongest one in terms of just getting out there and saying, you're doing it wrong. You're doing it wrong. We've got to turn this around or else. And what he actually predicted during his time was what did happen, and that was the first fall of the temple. Well, those are all good guesses. but they weren't quite home yet. And Jesus wanted to know more than what others said. Who do you think I am? What do you say? Simon Peter had this uncontrollable personality, I get the impression of. And like a kid in school, first one with his hand up. First one with his hand up. I know. Simon Peter answered, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." He was the first one to use the word Messiah in the Bible. And Jesus answered him, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah. For flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven. And I tell you now," you were Peter, Simon, or Simon Peter, actually. "You are now Peter," which means, in the Greek translation, it's rock. "And on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. I will give you the keys to the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." Then he sternly ordered the disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Messiah. Well, Jesus was really impressed with Peter. So you would think that Peter would be the one that he expected to go out, build a church, and it would go on and on. Well, that's the point. If it were to go on and on, it was not just up to Peter, was it? It was up to people all down through the ages, including us today. We are all the rock of the church. We can all take that as part of our name, the rock of the church. Well, the names that we use for people can be truly hurtful, as we know. Many of us have known names that have hurt. Many of us have known symbols or tags or whatever that have not been the least bit kind and that have been destructive. But names can also be positive. And using a person's name, the name that they appreciate, the name that they understand themselves to be, can be so uplifting, and it can build a relationship. It can build relationships between people. So when you think about the labels that you've had over the years, whether they've been silly nicknames or whether they have been nasty names in some way, remember not only how they affected you, but how you can affect others when you use names that show them that they are respected, that they are loved every bit as much as anybody else in the world. We can affirm people by their names. We can remember what it feels like to be called by someone who loves us, to be called by someone who cares about us, by a loving name. Let us be sure that we share that knowledge, that understanding, as we go out with other people. Now, one entity we haven't mentioned yet is God, who has not one name, but many names. And I was thinking, if God only had one name, how could God go through all of life's stages with us? If God only was young, what happens to a lot of us here? If God were only white, what happens to those who aren't white? If God God were only old and wise and couldn't get into the mind of a child, what would happen to our children? I have an understanding of a God who has to have many names, and God will never have enough names, because there's no way to describe a God who can understand all of us in every language and still be able to support each one of us as a beloved child. So as we sing the song, God, or give us, what is it called? It's not God of many names.
Bring many names.
I mean, bring many names. I would invite you to stand now and let's sing Bring Many Names, which is hymn number 11.
Yes. And you said